The clock doesn't hesitate, friend. It marches on whether you move with confidence or freeze in uncertainty. You feel this, don't you? That forward pull that refuses to pause, refuses to grant you one more moment to gather yourself. Each second slips into what can never be revisited again, sealing away possibilities you hadn't realized were already fading. And hidden inside that relentless advance is a truth most people never dare to look at directly. The moment itself carries a doorway. You may not notice it at first, because everyone is taught to assume that change obeys a straight, trudging line. That rewiring who you are demands months of grinding effort, maybe years of wrestling with patterns you didn't choose, but somehow inherited. Yet beneath that familiar narrative sits another pattern, one drawn from the physics you rarely apply to your own becoming. When you commit fully, cleanly, your entire state aligns with intention, and in that instant a different potential becomes available, not later, not someday, now. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the clock is already dragging you forward, which version of reality are you allowing it to pull you into? You were conditioned to imagine transformation as an endless ascent, a climb up a cold mountain where every step requires strain. But every steep path hides a narrow passage few eyes ever see, a quiet shortcut woven into the rock itself. And that passage doesn't open through pushing. It opens through resonance. Quantum researchers often describe particles holding multiple outcomes at once until observation selects a single form. Consider what that implies for your own life. The reality you think demands years of construction may already exist as unclaimed potential, waiting for you to align with it in this breath, in this heartbeat. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's the nature of possibility itself. But here's where it turns strange. Most people never find the passage not because it's missing, but because they've fallen under the hypnosis of time. They stare at the swinging motion of life like a mesmerizing pendulum, believing movement itself defines reality. Yet if you shift your attention from the swing to the still center, holding it all together, you'll notice something else entirely, a point untouched by time's motion. A point where transformation accelerates because you're no longer tangled in the rhythm that once controlled you. You can feel the echo of that still point lingering, the quiet axis that exists beneath the pendulum's swing. And from that silence, something else becomes visible, something you may have sensed your whole life without ever naming. The moment you step toward that inner stillness, you collide with a wall that wasn't built by you, but built into you. A belief system inherited from generations who trusted the swing more than the center, who trusted time more than resonance. This is where the conditioning begins to reveal itself. Because you weren't just taught how to grow, you were taught how long growth should take. And that timeline wasn't designed for your liberation. It was designed for your obedience. Consider how early the pattern takes hold. As a child, you're told to be patient, to wait your turn, to earn every inch of progress by proving yourself worthy through difficulty. By adulthood, that idea mutates into a silent assumption. If something comes quickly, it must be shallow. If change arrives easily, it must be unrealistic. If transformation happens fast, it must be unstable. So you distrust speed. You distrust ease. You distrust your own breakthroughs. And because you distrust them, you collapse the slower path by default. You might not even notice you're doing it. You wake up each day inside a worldview that frames progress as something grueling, something that almost demands suffering as proof of legitimacy. Society validates that view because it's profitable. Industries thrive when you believe change requires long programs, extended subscriptions, endless check-ins, constant labor. Entire economic systems depend on your faith in slow growth. So of course, you internalize it. Of course, you confuse endurance with truth. But what if that entire framework is the spell? What if the belief in linear growth is the very mechanism that keeps you looping through the same timeline, year after year? Look at it this way: if reality responds to your internal state more than your external effort, then believing it must take time ensures that time becomes the gatekeeper you can never outrun. Not because the universe demands delay, but because your expectation of delay becomes the frequency you broadcast. And the field simply mirrors that expectation back. You've seen this pattern in other people. Someone wants to change their life, but before they begin, they whisper, "I know it's going to take a long time." They're not describing the future, they're instructing it. They're preloading the field with delay. They're tuning their entire emotional system to uncertainty, hesitation, and distance. Their belief becomes the broadcast that shapes their timeline. This is the tragedy of cultural conditioning. You inherit a schedule that never belonged to you. Yet deep down, you've also felt the opposite, those rare moments when life shifts instantly. A decision, a conversation, a realization, a single breath that rearranges your internal landscape faster than years of forcing ever could. Those moments feel miraculous because they break the spell of slow change. They reveal what was always possible, but they also expose something more uncomfortable. You knew it could be that fast. You just weren't taught to trust that speed. This is why the hidden mountain passage remains invisible to most. Not because it's distant, but because your perception filters it out. If your belief system is tuned to hardship, ease becomes unrecognizable. If your nervous system equates safety with struggle, simplicity feels suspicious. You'll walk right past the shortcut because your mind insists the long road is the real one. So the question becomes intimate. What if the slow path was never your path? What if the hardest part of transformation isn't changing your life, but unlearning the belief that change must be hard? This is where your relationship with time begins to unravel. This is where you stop worshiping delay, because once you realize that the belief in slow change is just conditioning, not truth, not physics, not destiny, you begin to sense the flexibility underneath your experience. You feel the inner still point warming, expanding, inviting you to question everything you were taught about how long it takes to become someone new. And when that questioning starts, your timeline loosens. Your internal rigidity cracks. A different pace becomes possible, one that doesn't bow to the clock, one that doesn't beg time for permission. You start to notice that what you were calling patience was actually self-doubt. What you labeled discipline was disguised fear. What you celebrated as hard work was sometimes just resistance in ceremonial clothing. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to recognize how much of your life has been shaped by inherited timelines, not your own resonance. You start to understand why the shortcut feels foreign. You were trained to expect the mountain, not the hidden passage carved within it. But now that you've seen the still point, now that the spell is breaking, the path ahead begins to reorganize. And the next truth becomes impossible to ignore. If time isn't the currency, something else must be. And that's where coherence enters the story. Coherence enters right where the old timelines fall apart, rising through the cracks left behind when you stop worshiping delay. It arrives quietly at first, like a frequency you've heard before but never fully tuned into. And from the moment you sense it, you realize something profound. If time was never the real currency of transformation, coherence has been the currency all along. Coherence is what happens when the scattered pieces of you finally speak the same language. Your thoughts stop pulling in one direction while your emotions drag toward another. Your body stops bracing for a danger that isn't there. Everything begins to move as one. You might think of coherence as harmony, but it's more than harmony. It's resonance, it's precision, it's alignment powerful enough to collapse a potential into a lived moment. Imagine two tuning forks. Strike one and the other vibrates instantly, not because it tried, not because it strained, but because it shared the same frequency. That's coherence. There's no time gap between cause and response. No waiting, no grinding, just immediate resonance. Your inner world works the same way, but most people live like detuned instruments. Thoughts humming one note, emotions buzzing another, physiology clenching into a third. The signal becomes noisy. The field responds to the noise. And life feels slow, heavy, resistant. But when coherence appears, the noise quiets. The signal strengthens, and the field reflects that strength back with astonishing speed. Here's the paradox. People blame the universe for being unresponsive, but the universe is only echoing the broadcast they're sending. When your state is fragmented, the echo returns fragmented. When your state is unified, the echo returns unified. Coherence is the unity. You see this reflected in simple biological moments. Remember the last time you felt sudden fear? Your heart rate spiked immediately, your stomach tightened. Chemicals flushed through your system in an instant. Not tomorrow, not after practice, instantly. Your body didn't need hours to embody fear. It needed one thought, one image, one memory. If fear can reorganize your entire physiology in seconds, why wouldn't gratitude? Why wouldn't empowerment? Why wouldn't clarity, joy, or conviction? The body isn't slow. The body is immediate. It's your awareness that hesitates. It's your belief system that demands delay. It's your conditioning that interrupts the natural rapidity built into your biology. This is why coherence becomes the true currency, because it bypasses the mental story about how long transformation should take and taps directly into the mechanism that's always been fast. Think of a seed planted in fertile soil. If left alone, it grows. If dug up repeatedly to check progress, it stalls. Doubt is the digging. Distraction is the digging. Skepticism is the digging. Each disruption pulls you out of coherence and forces the field to restart the process over and over again. When your attention stabilizes, coherence stabilizes. When coherence stabilizes, the seed grows. And when the seed grows uninterrupted, it grows fast. Here's where the hidden passage becomes visible again. Because coherence isn't mystical, it's mechanical. It's the nervous system, the heart field, and the brain aligning into a single signal strong enough to imprint onto your timeline. When that signal holds, even briefly, you feel it, your breath deepens, the noise in your mind drops, and a subtle warmth rises behind your sternum. That moment isn't relaxation, it's communication. The field hears you clearly, and this clarity accelerates everything. But coherence alone isn't enough. It's the doorway, not the destination. It opens the passage, but something must walk through. The next layer is embodiment, when coherence stops being a moment you touch and becomes the frequency you live. And once embodiment ignites, the timeline you once thought was distant begins to approach with surprising speed. That's where we turn next into the body, where coherence becomes a broadcast and desire becomes a state of being. You can feel coherence humming beneath your awareness, like a signal waiting to be amplified. And from that hum, the next truth rises naturally. Coherence becomes power only when it moves from the mind into the body. This is where transformation stops being something you think about and becomes something you broadcast. This is the realm of embodiment, where your entire system becomes the prayer, not the words you speak. Embodiment is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a mindset, a mood, or a belief, but embodiment is biological. It's electromagnetic. It's structural. It's the moment your nervous system starts acting as if the future you're choosing is already here. Not because you're pretending, but because your physiology can no longer tell the difference between imagination and experience. Science gestures toward this, through studies showing that the brain fires identical neural patterns, whether you vividly imagine an action or perform it physically. Mystics describe the same truth poetically: you must become the state before the state becomes your life. Think of a dancer rehearsing new choreography. At first, every movement is stiff, conscious, unnatural. The body hasn't absorbed the rhythm yet. The mind has to micromanage every position, but then something subtle happens. Repetition dissolves into flow. The dancer stops remembering and starts becoming. The dance moves through them rather than being forced by them. That moment is embodiment, the point where practice ends and identity begins. Your inner work follows the same trajectory. You don't memorize gratitude, you become the one who radiates it. You don't rehearse confidence, you become the one who stands in it. You don't chase alignment, you become alignment. This is why thinking your way into change rarely works. Thoughts without emotion remain conceptual. Emotion without bodily presence becomes unstable, and bodily shifts without intention quickly regress. But when thought, emotion, and physiology converge into one frequency, you imprint something deeper, what you might call vibrational encoding. Vibrational encoding is the moment your body transmits the future as if it's already lived. It's not visualization, it's not affirmation, it's integration. Imagine your body as a transmitter tower. Every cell radiates electromagnetic signals. Your heart produces a field measurable several feet beyond your skin. Your brain creates patterns that ripple through your entire system. When these patterns synchronize, the broadcast strengthens, and your reality organizes around that signal the way iron filings arrange around a magnet. This is why certain people walk into a room and others feel them before they speak. Their presence says more than their words ever could. Their coherence speaks for them. But the opposite is also true. When you feel fragmented, your signal scatters. You might be thinking abundant thoughts while your body clings to survival tension. You might be repeating loving words while your chest contracts in old self-protection. The signal becomes divided, and the field mirrors that division back through mixed results and stalled manifestations. Embodiment fixes the division by unifying the signal. And here's where the uncomfortable truth surfaces. Most people struggle not because embodiment is complicated, but because ease feels unsafe. They've been trained emotionally, biologically, socially to associate survival with tension. Their muscles remember hardship. Their breath rehearses bracing. Their nervous system confuses chaos with normalcy. So when coherence arrives, it feels foreign. When gratitude floods the body, it feels suspicious. When alignment appears, it feels unearned. The body resists the very frequency it longs for. This is why embodiment requires compassion. You're not just creating a new reality, you're retraining a nervous system that spent years adapting to old ones. The body isn't betraying you when it resists coherence. It's protecting you based on outdated information. When you bring awareness into that resistance, the body softens. When you breathe into it, the signal stabilizes. When you stay with the new frequency long enough, the body begins to trust it. And that trust is everything. Because once the body trusts the new reality, it broadcasts it effortlessly. This is the turning point where the field responds with startling speed. Not because you forced change, but because you became the frequency that change responds to. From here, a deeper question emerges. If embodiment is the broadcast, what keeps the signal from staying coherent? That's where we turn next into the hidden addiction to struggle, and why ease feels like a threat before it feels like home. You can feel the body beginning to trust the broadcast you're sending, even if only in brief flashes. But just as that trust starts to form, something within you pushes back. A subtle contraction, a tightening in the chest, a familiar heaviness rising without warning. And this is where the deeper truth surfaces. The resistance isn't random. It's conditioned. It's patterned. It's old protection disguised as identity. The struggle doesn't cling to you because you're broken. Struggle clings because your system was trained to treat difficulty as safety. From childhood forward, you were rewarded for enduring hardship. You heard phrases like, no pain, no gain, don't take shortcuts, nothing good comes easy. These weren't just sayings, they were instructions. Instructions that shaped your nervous system. Instructions that embedded themselves into your muscles, your breath, your posture, your reflexes. Instructions that told your body ease is suspicious, effort is trustworthy. So when you begin stepping into coherence, the body interprets it as unfamiliar terrain. And unfamiliar terrain, even when it feels good, often triggers the defenses that were built to protect you long before you had the awareness to challenge them. This is why so many people sabotage their own breakthroughs, not because they don't want transformation, but because their body equates comfort with danger, because their biology was sculpted inside environments where vigilance felt necessary, because their earliest experiences taught them that safety is earned, not received. Think about how your muscles tighten when you're about to relax deeply. Think about how your mind rushes to solve problems that aren't there. Think about how quickly you brace when someone tells you good news, as if good news must be balanced by an incoming threat. That bracing isn't a flaw. It's an outdated survival code. But once coherence begins spreading through your internal landscape, the old code reacts like an alarm system triggered by a false positive. You feel unease not because you're on the wrong path, but because you're stepping beyond the boundaries your system was taught to call normal. This is where compassion becomes essential, not indulgence, not avoidance. Compassion. Compassion is the energy that teaches your body a new definition of safety. Because let's be honest, ease doesn't just feel new. Ease can feel unnerving. Ease can feel empty. Ease can feel like the quiet before the storm. Your nervous system may whisper, "This can't last," or "Something must be wrong," or "Don't trust this feeling." These whispers aren't self-sabotage, they're outdated guardians. Parts of you that learned long ago that stability comes from anticipating struggle. But here's the crucial turning point. Those guardians lose their authority the moment you meet them with presence instead of panic. When you feel resistance rise and choose to breathe into it, instead of collapse into the old story, a new message reaches the body. We're safe now. It doesn't take years. It takes repetition. It takes showing the body again and again that ease doesn't mean danger. That alignment doesn't lead to loss. That coherence isn't a trap, it's home. There's a moment in every transformation where the body hesitates on the threshold. A moment where the new timeline feels possible but not yet natural. A moment when you're tempted to return to the familiar tension simply because you know how to survive inside it. That moment is your initiation. You stand between two frequencies, the old, built on vigilance, and the new, built on trust. The old, driven by survival reflexes, and the new, driven by coherence. The old, shaped by inherited stories, and the new, shaped by embodied truth. And the choice you make in that moment determines everything. Because when you choose to stay inside the ease, when you breathe through the guilt, the doubt, the contraction, you begin rewriting the very chemistry of your experience. The survival patterns stop running the show. The muscles stop expecting impact. The nervous system stops looking for the exit. You begin to embody a level of safety that your younger self never had access to. From that safety, coherence stabilizes. From that stability, embodiment deepens. And from that embodiment, the possibility of rapid transformation becomes not just believable, but natural. But there's still one more step. A step that takes everything you've learned, the coherence, the embodiment, the reclaimed safety, and focuses it through the simplest, most direct technique you possess, the breath. The breath rises right where the old resistance begins to dissolve, filling the space your struggle once occupied. And as it enters, you recognize something almost shocking in its simplicity. The breath is not just a biological function, it's a switch, a lever, a direct interface between your awareness, your body, and the field around you. Everything you've explored so far, the coherence, the embodiment, the release of old survival codes, funnels into this one point of contact. Because breath is the only process in your body that is both automatic and consciously controllable. It's the bridge between what happens to you and what you choose. It's the moment where you stop reacting and start creating. You've felt this before without naming it. The breath that steadies you before a difficult conversation. The inhale that expands your chest when clarity returns. The exhale that dissolves tension you didn't know you were holding. These aren't coincidences. They're brief flashes of coherence activating on their own. Now you're going to learn to activate them deliberately. The fastest timeline shift doesn't require years of meditation or hours of visualization. It doesn't demand rituals or mantras or complex frameworks. It asks for one thing: a single coherent breath executed with precision, presence, and emotional voltage. Here's how the mechanism unfolds. When you draw breath into the heart space, not the upper chest, not the throat, but the center of the sternum, you initiate a neurological reset. Nerves surrounding the heart send signals to the brain indicating safety, presence, and openness. In that moment, survival patterns loosen, muscles unclench, the nervous system downshifts. You create internal stillness without forcing it. While you hold that breath, not in strain, but in quiet suspension, you enter the axis behind the pendulum. Time loosens its grip. The mind stops chasing. The body listens. Then comes the exhale, slow, intentional, and infused with elevated emotion. This is the critical part most people skip. Without emotion, the breath is mechanical. With emotion, the breath becomes a transmitter. You generate gratitude, joy, freedom, or whatever state aligns with the reality you're choosing, not as fantasy, but as a sensation your body can feel. You're teaching your biology the frequency of the future. You're programming the nervous system to broadcast a new signal. You're collapsing the timeline through resonance, not effort. Science quietly supports this. Studies from a heart-brain research show that when breathing techniques combine with elevated emotion, the body's electromagnetic field becomes coherent and highly ordered. That coherence doesn't just shift what you feel. Internally, it radiates outward into the environment, interacting with the probabilities already available in the field. In other words, the breath becomes a tuning fork for your entire reality. And because coherence is fast, this transformation is fast. But here's where most people lose the magic. They taste the alignment once, then immediately return to their old stress pattern. They treat coherence as a moment instead of a practice. They assume the shift didn't stick because the world didn't instantly rearrange itself. Yet reality doesn't resist you. It waits for consistency. If you practiced this breath with genuine embodiment 2 or 3 times a day, just a few minutes in total, your nervous system would begin reorganizing at a fundamental level. The field would lock on to the new broadcast. Life would start responding faster than your mind can rationally explain. This isn't intensity of effort. It's intensity of presence. One breath, felt fully, repeated consistently. That's the quantum shortcut. But breath is only the ignition. The next shift happens when you learn to stabilize the new timeline, not just in moments of practice, but in the rhythm of your everyday life. You can almost feel the afterglow, of that coherent breath lingering inside you, like a subtle warmth that refuses to fade. And that's the point, because the breath isn't meant to be a spark you ignite once. It's meant to become the rhythm that carries you from momentary alignment into a stable new baseline. This is where the shift turns from an experience into a lifestyle, from an insight into a lived frequency. Most people never reach this stage, not because they lack ability, but because they treat coherence as an event, not a habit. They wait for perfect conditions to practice. They breathe deeply only when they're overwhelmed or inspired. They treat alignment as a dramatic moment rather than a quiet daily choice. But the nervous system speaks the language of repetition, not rarity. Think of a river carving its path through stone. One drop of water does nothing, but continuous flow reshapes mountains, creates canyons, alters entire landscapes. Your coherence works the same way. One intentional breath can shift your state, but repeated breaths reshape your identity. This is where stabilization begins. Every time you pause, bring awareness to the heart, breathe deeply into the space behind your sternum, and exhale with emotion. You reinforce the neural pathways associated with safety, presence, and empowerment. Neuroscientists call this Hebbian learning neurons that fire together, wire together. Mystics call it devotion. Psychologists call it pattern rewriting. The field calls it coherence. The language differs, but the mechanism is the same. What begins as a conscious act slowly becomes the natural resting point of your awareness. Your body starts anticipating alignment rather than resisting it. Your breath deepens on its own. Your mind quiets without being forced. You begin waking in the morning with a softness in your chest that wasn't there before. And something remarkable happens. You stop chasing breakthroughs. Breakthrough becomes your default. Because when your baseline frequency rises, life reorganizes itself to match. Opportunities sync with your state. Relationships shift. Creative energy returns. Unexpected clarity arrives without effort. Synchronicities cluster around you like signposts acknowledging the new broadcast. This isn't magic, it's tuning. But stabilization requires one more ingredient: remembering. Every day, the external world will try to pull you back: notifications, deadlines, noise, other people's fear, unresolved stories from your past. Each pull is an invitation to return to the old frequency. Your task is simple, not easy. Remember the breath, remember the axis, remember the coherence. The quicker you remember, the faster you re-enter alignment. At first, you may need to pause consciously several times a day. But over time, remembrance becomes reflexive. You'll feel your body drifting into contraction and correct it before it solidifies. You'll catch your breath shortening and deepen it automatically. You'll notice your shoulders rising and release them before tension takes root. This is stabilization, when coherence becomes the path of least resistance. And with each day that you return to the breath, you anchor the timeline you've chosen more deeply. You stop waiting for your new reality to arrive and start inhabiting it ahead of time. You stop hoping for transformation and begin living as transformed. But once coherence becomes consistent, a new understanding starts to surface, one that bends the rules even further. You begin to sense that speed is no longer the ultimate metric. You start noticing moments when time itself feels thinner, less authoritative. You begin slipping into states where minutes stretch or vanish, and outcomes appear without delay. That's when you're ready for the next layer, moving from accelerated time into timelessness itself. You arrive at timelessness through the very doorway stabilization builds, almost without noticing the threshold beneath your feet. One moment you're practicing coherence, breath by breath, and the next, something unusual begins to happen. Time stops feeling like a rigid structure and starts behaving more like a suggestion. Minutes stretch, Hours disappear. Solutions arrive before the problem is fully understood. And you realize speed was never the point. Speed still belongs to the clock. Timelessness belongs to you. Because once your baseline coherence stabilizes, the rules you were taught to obey begin to dissolve. Time no longer feels like a ruler measuring your worth. Time stops dictating how long transformation should take. Time becomes flexible, responsive, elastic. This is the entrance into the quantum state where change doesn't accelerate. It detaches from linear sequence entirely. You've tasted this before. You've had moments where inspiration hits and hours vanish in what feels like minutes. You've experienced flow when your mind quiets, your body moves effortlessly, and something larger seems to work through you. You've had conversations that felt suspended outside the usual rhythm of time, where everything lands with clarity and depth. Those weren't anomalies. They were previews. Glimpses of who you become when coherence deepens enough for the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain obsessed with tracking time, to step aside. Neuroscience refers to this as transient hypofrontality, the temporary quieting of the mental clock. Mystics call it presence. Quantum thinkers call it the point of pure potential. Different languages for the same phenomenon. You exit the timeline and enter the field. In that field, the future isn't something you move toward. It's something you access. It's a frequency, not a destination. It's a state, not a schedule. When you live in accelerated time, you still chase. When you live in timelessness, you receive. This shift seems subtle, but it utterly rewrites how you create your reality. Because as long as you're trying to move faster, you're still operating under the illusion that time is real, solid, and in charge. But when you embody timelessness, you stop broadcasting the frequency of "not yet," and the field stops mirroring delay. Imagine existence from the perspective of light. A photon travels across galaxies, but from its own frame of reference. No time passes at all. It moves without aging. It arrives without waiting. It exists in an endless now. Your consciousness is built from that same fabric. When you enter coherence deeply enough, you begin living from the photon's logic rather than the clock's logic. Timelessness isn't a mystical escape. It's the natural state beneath the conditioning you've carried since childhood. The conditioning that told you to wait your turn. The conditioning that convinced you to earn what you're already connected to. The conditioning that taught you that desire and fulfillment must be separated by struggle. But the mind that tracks time is not the mind that creates reality. When you slip into timelessness, desire loses its tension. You no longer long for the future, you embody the frequency of it now. You no longer strain for outcomes, they flow toward the coherence you radiate. You no longer measure progress, you become progress. This is why people who enter deep coherence often describe an eerie simplicity. Things just happen. Doors open effortlessly, circumstances reconfigure with uncanny precision. Others interpret this as luck, intuition, or divine timing. But it's something even more intimate, your inner state collapsing temporal distance. Timelessness is not an escape from life. It's the way life feels when you stop living in the past or future and return entirely to the axis, the unmoving center, where everything becomes available at once. And once you taste this state, the question becomes, how do you live it daily? How do you move through a world of clocks while anchored in a self that no longer bows to them? That's where we go next, into the art of living as timeless coherence in a time-bound world. Timelessness doesn't free you from the world. You still wake up to alarms, navigate calendars, answer messages, and move through the ordinary rhythm of days. But once you've touched the axis beneath time, something subtle begins to shift. You're no longer inside the pressure of the clock. You're alongside it, moving through the world with a frequency that isn't dictated by hurry, fear, or lack. This is the art of living as timeless coherence in a time-bound world, learning to stay anchored in the still point while everything around you continues to swing. You've probably noticed this already. Situations that used to trigger urgency feel less sharp. Deadlines seem clearer but less threatening. Conversations unfold with more space. You respond instead of react. This isn't behavioral training. It's the natural side effect of coherence stabilizing your perception. Because when you're no longer broadcasting the frequency of not enough time, the world stops reflecting urgency back at you. People who live in chronic stress often believe the world is stressful. But stress is a feedback loop. Your state shapes your perception. Your perception shapes your experience, and your experience reinforces your state. Break the state, and the loop dissolves. But here's where something even more interesting emerges. Synchronicity. Not coincidence, not chance, not superstition. Synchronicity is what happens when your internal frequency becomes clear enough for the outer world to organize itself around it. You've had glimpses of this. Thinking of someone moments before they call, stumbling onto information precisely when you need it, meeting the right person at the perfect time, feeling guided by patterns that seem too coordinated to be accidental. Most people treat synchronicity as a curiosity, but in the state of timeless coherence, it becomes a language, not a language of words, but of alignment. Synchronicity is the field confirming your signal. It's the echo of your broadcast, returning as physical events. It's reality saying, "You're in phase. Keep going." This is why living from timelessness doesn't make you passive. It makes you receptive. You stop forcing outcomes, yet outcomes materialize more smoothly. You stop chasing signs, yet signs appear with increasing clarity. You stop begging life to move, because life is already moving toward you. But staying in this frequency requires awareness, because the world will constantly tempt you back into the old rhythm. You'll feel the pull of someone else's urgency. You'll sense the weight of collective fear. You'll encounter environments that run on stress the way an engine runs on fuel. Your task is not to escape these environments. Your task is to remain the axis within them. This means returning to the breath in conversations that escalate too quickly. It means settling into coherence when decisions feel pressured. It means noticing when your chest tightens not as a failure, but as a cue to re-anchor. The moment you return to the still point, time loosens its grip again. And here's the quiet miracle: when you bring timeless coherence into time-bound spaces, you change those spaces. People feel calmer around you. Conflicts dissolve more easily. Opportunities seem to cluster. You become a stabilizing frequency in environments that have forgotten their own center. This is why many who live in coherence feel as though they're guided not by destiny, but by resonance. They follow the subtle pull of alignment, and life responds with a precision that feels orchestrated. Not because fate is intervening, but because the field is echoing back the clarity they hold. To live this way is to become a different kind of participant in reality. Not a reactor, not a chaser, not a survivor of time, but a transmitter, someone whose presence bends events into harmony. And that brings us to the final revelation. Once you live as coherence, your frequency stops being personal. It begins to affect the collective field itself. That's the doorway we walk through next, into the power of becoming the broadcast that others tune to. You can feel it already, the way coherence doesn't just stay inside your body anymore. It radiates, it reaches, it interacts. And this is where the final truth emerges with unmistakable clarity. Once you stabilize timeless coherence within yourself, your frequency stops being an internal experience and becomes a field that other people unconsciously tune to. You're no longer just living your timeline. You're influencing the timelines of everyone who comes near you. Most people underestimate this. They imagine their inner state as something private, sealed behind skin and thought. But your electromagnetic field extends outward several feet. Your emotional patterns ripple through your posture, your breath, your tone, your coherence when genuine acts like a silent tuning fork, and the people around you can't help but vibrate in response. You've felt this dynamic in others. The friend whose presence calms a room without saying a word. The stranger whose grounded energy makes you breathe easier. The mentor who seems to open doors simply by standing in their truth. These individuals aren't special, they're coherent, and coherence is contagious. This is why communities, even small ones, accelerate transformation. When one person anchors into the axis, others feel the invitation even if they can't articulate it. Your frequency becomes a reminder of what their nervous systems have forgotten. You don't have to teach anything. You don't have to explain. You simply embody. And embodiment transmits more effectively than instruction ever could. In a very real way, you become a living broadcast, not a preacher of ideas, but a transmitter of states, not a persuader, but an activator, not a seeker, but a signal. And signals ripple outward. They shift conversation. They soften conflict. They awaken memory in people who believed they were stuck. They create coherence pockets, spaces where time slows, stress dissolves, and clarity rises without effort. This is why the world feels different when you change. Reality doesn't shift because the universe makes an exception for you. Reality shifts because your frequency alters what you notice, what you attract, what you tolerate, and what resonates with you. Collective timelines emerge from these micro-shifts. Imagine a room of people, each broadcasting scattered frequencies, fear, impatience, tension. Now imagine one person stepping into coherence. Their breath deepens, their chest softens, their awareness settles. Within moments, others begin adjusting unconsciously to match the more stable signal. The entire room reorganizes. This isn't metaphor, it's resonance at scale. And as more individuals embody timeless coherence, entire communities begin to vibrate differently. The field becomes stronger, clearer, more intelligent. The timeline itself bends. This is why your transformation matters far beyond your personal life. Your coherence becomes an offering. Your breath becomes influence. Your presence becomes permission. You become the reminder that others didn't know they needed. And the moment you recognize yourself as a broadcast stable, clear, and timeless, you step fully into the truth that's been whispering through every layer of this journey. Your inner state is not just shaping your reality, it's shaping our shared reality. You can still feel the resonance of that last insight, the recognition that your coherence doesn't end at your skin, and it's from that recognition that we soften the arc, letting the intensity dissolve into something quieter, gentler, closer, because the final movement of this transmission isn't about expansion anymore. It's about returning to the center with new eyes, carrying everything you've uncovered back into the simplicity of this moment, this breath, this now. You've walked through the hidden passage. You've touched the axis behind the pendulum. You've stepped into coherence, embodiment, ease, and timelessness. And whether you realize it or not, your field is already different. Feel into that. Not as an idea, as sensation. Notice how your breath moves just a little more freely. Notice how the space behind your sternum feels more open, as if something unclenched while you weren't looking. Notice how the edges inside you have softened, not because someone gave you permission, but because you claimed that permission yourself. This is the part people often rush past. But don't let it land. Let the frequency settle through you. Let the body recognize that safety isn't something earned, it's something inhabited. Because this is where transformation truly anchors. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic breakthroughs, in the quiet decision to keep choosing coherence when the world forgets, in the choice to return to the breath when old patterns tug at your ankles, in the willingness to let timelessness guide your next step rather than urgency. If there's any call to action here, it's a soft one. Choose one breath today that you inhabit fully. Choose one moment to return to the axis. Choose one intention to broadcast gently through your field. Not to force a new timeline, but to relax into the one that's already waiting for you. Because the doorway is here, the still point is here, and the now, your true canvas, is always open.